Welcome to Thai PBS World tonight. I am Nattha Komolvadhin, and it's another special night. I would like to bring you to a special webinar on Thailand 2020s and beyond, building up resilient society. This is a joint partnership of webinar arranged by IPPD, MIT, ThaiPBS and EIU. The second part of the seminar will focus on risk, resilient governance, and how to build up collective intelligence for having resilient society.
Pitchapa Jular, Principal Investigator from IPPD, to share her findings on risk, resilience and governance, particularly its relevance to cities and people.
Thank you very much, Nattha, and also thank you very much for all the speakers before me. I feel completely honored to be among all of you guys today. So I think my perspective for today, I'm just going to be giving on the behalf of the IPPD team to share with you today risk, resilience, and governance through the lens, as the title suggests, of the complex complexities of cities and people. So, but first of all, I think we need to scope down a little bit. We have seen an overview of how risk resilience domain has been looked at the international level and all across the world. What are the exciting innovations and how we should look at risk, right? But I think we also need to know how risk has been talked about at the international level, but also how Thailand actually talk about risk. I'm going to really scope it down from the global perspective to really our national level here. So of course, you know, having very vast and complex framework, risk can be categorized in a very clear themes and domains, right? So it's also made it easier, much easier for us to understand how to manage them in each of the domains. And also we can look at them through different values or lens of values, right? So that also goes back to the decision of what values do we trade off when we actually talk about risk. But just earlier this year, before COVID arrived, just in 2020, the World Economic Forum has just declared for the first time in decades, right, that the world thought leader has perceived that in a very recent and coming years, environmental risk will become or inflict the most impact on our lives and also cause consequences that is very long term. As for Thailand, the varying degrees of the impact and patterns of these environmental risks can be seen as flood, drought, and forest fire. As COVID is going on, you know, and also amplifying the different stories that is being materialized on the ground with actual people in it, right? So when you really think about this, the different places actually tells a very different stories of how impact, what kind of severity, what kind of story people are actually experiencing on the ground, right? At the ground level is very different from how you actually look at risk from the above level. So as we adopt the world view into the national level of Thailand, we might have missed, you know, this interconnectedness between the risk and between the ecosystem and the risk, and also the risk and the people. But also lastly, how to really manage across borders and the governance in order for us to ultimately reduce this vulnerability to create and build resiliency. So I think in this very talk, I will be picking just on one very particular type of risk as our case studies and also provide you a deep dive example. The next question is, I'm going to pick on flood risk, right? My next question would be, if we put flood risk in perspective, how are Thailand actually dealing with risk? Right? So if we scan through a numerous voices in media, we can see now a very, very strong perceptions towards very long overdue and unresolved trouble that persists in Thailand. So the way in which large institutions and government agencies give their best attempt to really handle flood risk might not actually respond to what's happening on the ground or what the actual communities might have needed. Mismanagement from institutions many times have caused the public to lose trust and hope, and also that expectations can sometimes turn to blame, and it becomes a very common sight and common mindset every year that floods hits Thailand. So many times, the measures that we have put forward as an institutions are quite reactive from the public's perspective instead of being proactive. So huge investment, as we hear, even though it's very important and necessary, but huge investment are right now relying so much on hard and rigid infrastructures that really responds to the event onset. This costly investments continues to actually create a cycle of perceived reliance from the people and the community for always seeking for external aids and capacity. But I think tonight we want to flip that perspective a little bit, as John has already laid out the foundation to the mindset. Today, what I would like to talk about is how do we flip that perspective and the discussion in a much rather simpler term, right? So I don't want to look at risk as challenges, as a villain, but rather look at risk as challenges and how we can really reflect and use that as an opportunity to reflect on our own capacity that leads to actions and decisions that we could make in advance. But also another point is when we look at risk in each of the domain and silos approach, we forgot a completely critical driver, which is the people and the context that both John and Stefano has touched on. Right? So the people and the context varies, and they are embodied with different values and perception, and that's become the complexity that we need to talk about and start to really string back when we talk about risk. So neglecting vulnerabilities will be costly, as repeated episodes of flood will exhaust tremendous resources, right? Both on human capital and budget, as well as increasing reliance on external help from the government. So our preliminary studies further tackles the vulnerable groups within Thailand to see where they are and who they are. If we look at the aggregate level at first, we want to see where this vulnerable people is located. Right? So if we look in 2016, for example, 9% of the population was already living under poverty. As John was just saying, income level was a good indicator as a baseline, right? Especially in the north, in the northeast, and in the south. But also we have to look, whereas in 2017, we have to look at the change in demographics in that as well. There is currently an average of 1 dependent per every 2 working age population at the national level. And these includes the proportion of children aged 15 and under, elders aged 60 and over, and disabled people requiring a caretaker to the number of working age population. But what does this mean, right? It means that we can foresee working age populations as a very important source of assistance to these vulnerable groups. So this is a critical factor very much to capture the existing capacity on how people and human resources and us as a country can respond and deal with risk. So neglecting people in the context and as a centerpiece of the planning and management for any disaster will suffer in the long run. How we are going to look at this, I'm going to bring you 2 different cases of studies so that we can really touch on the ground what's happening at the level of different cities and people. So in Bangkok, for example, the urbanized growth poles concentrated very much in the city centers. And of course, many valuable businesses, assets, infrastructure congregated within the very hard lining of the flood wall protection, which is lined in blue line here. So you can see, if you look on the right-hand side, the flood risk, repeated flood risk area of this map actually tells us a lot of things. There are a clear division between the area which is being protected and the area which is surrounded and are repeatedly suffering from floods. Right? But also within this perceived safety, those who are not experiencing flood has a very different kind of mindset than those who experience flood. So conflict in planning in this area, for example, such as the location of high-value infrastructure, like the Don Mueang Airport, right, is neglecting or even not looking at the overlook the flood-prone conditions. So the entire airport was submerged in water in 2011. Land use planning and of course zoning becomes a very much critical area to start talking about how we locate and start preparing our city towards flood. But also costly damages to all the urban infrastructure ripples the livelihood of the people as well, such as working day losses, affected GDP and the economy. So the news and report and media also track flood-prone areas mainly focuses on the street, right? That potentially delay commutes to the productive work environment. But also on the other side of this flood wall, right, is possibly not the most inclusive solution for people on the ground. From the research, we see that highly flood-affected districts at the periphery of Bangkok are concentrated with vulnerable populations, including low-income housing and workers. So without planning and protection, ad hoc and troublesome responses emerges as a use of sandbag that keeps one side of the lining dry, but the other really highly flooded. Flood is no longer just risk, but it's a rising dispute over inequality and trade-off, right? Who gain and who losses, it becomes a geopolitics. So the community located here, you can see that the dense urban area is very much different from how the community perceives. But also with our collaborations with Wiseye Thailand social media listening platform, we also assess the risk perception of urban residents through voices in media. So the media actually focuses so much on waste and the trash management, but also focuses largely on the ineffective hard infrastructures, and secondly, the government responsibility that are reactive. So as the city become more detached and disintegrated from the resources around it, such as the canal, the government also increasingly responded with much hard engineering solutions, right, such as large infrastructural investment. There are less reflection on spatial planning, of course, and the zoning law regulations. So therefore, if we look at the vertical governance of how risks are managed or disaster risks are managed, the structure you can see right now that it's overlaying of agency and different kind of responses, right? There are still very much ways to integrate this ecosystem more dynamically than what we see in this one. But just as the flood wall keeps the inner city dry, it also keeps Bangkok unequally drier than other provinces as well. So the next step, we actually look at the Ubon Ratchathani area, which is the very upcoming rising second-tier city, where we see a dual kind of growing tension between urbanization and rural agricultural areas. So the responses are actually a bit different from what we see in the urban centers of Bangkok, for example. Also, the demographic is very different, looking at the vulnerabilities and the dependent population of over 33%. We see that right now, the government are being blamed again through the social media and voices that peaks during 2018 when Ubon Ratchathani suffers from tremendous loss in flood. The social safety nets and the government failure of ineffective budget allocation to really reach the farmers and the vulnerable villagers has been talked about so much. But then there is also this interesting emergence of using technology such as phones and social media to garner key influential responses and collective responses to rally for donations. It's also revealed a little bit of the trust issue as an underlying structure here. So in Ubon, people's perception towards risk mitigation tends to actually shift to role models and key influencer rather than relying on the government and centralized management. The last example that I wanted to give is actually a very, very small mid-sized city called Hatnong community in Uthai Thani province. This province lies in the confluences of the Chao Phraya River, which suffered the same 2011 flood that lasted for about 3 months at the 4-meter height, the entire 3 months. So what I would like to assess and describe to you today about this community is that it has a very different mindset and contrastingly radical, interesting approach to deal with flood. So the research undertook with extensive documentation living with the community to assess and identify the social and governance structure of how they manage community-based flood and resource management. So within this province, you can see that there are some of the wise words being captured here that recognizes that they are recognizing the importance of adaptation and capacity buildings. Over 1,000 clips and interview transcription has led to a very few clear repeated words, right, and interpretation that connects their values together as a community. So the core insight from the research observes shared mindset for constant adaptation, leadership, and self-governing attitude. They also focus on the development that embrace and adopt risk as a natural state of mind. So most importantly, they also consider well-being in this management of risk at the beginning. So they are interestingly caught up in cultural elements such as food and freshly cooked meal that people were proud to say that they have, a very substance basic during crisis. Risk here is being perceived beyond losses. They have shifted target to stay thriving amid uncertainty instead of just dealing with risk. So in translating this into actions, the attitude also carries through the transformative actions and proactive communications on the ground. So of course, there are like four different kind of categories in which we could start looking at how they translated this action onto the ground. The database and dynamic knowledge regeneration through co-creation of risk mapping and coupon for food, or even fresh food delivery system, creating a communal kitchen and delivery to each of the household throughout all 3 months. The medical care and delivery system that start the daily check-in with the medication to vulnerable people's elderly. So the public health center as a community space become the vital important element. But that thereafter, there is this adaptation or wholly shift or a paradigm shift towards collective plots. So they started this rice calendar and water user association to keep the season, to shift the entire agricultural and seasonal rice farming to earlier when flood arrived. So they entirely shift the conventional practice towards a new paradigm. Also, there are all the governance, and if we see this entire structure as a dynamic kind of responses, there's always a two-way communication that has always been played in. Right? And each of the actors has a very clear role and also knows that rules are not rigid and it's ever changing in the face of crisis. But as a summary, we can also see that there are a very interesting component and important components of leadership, lifestyle, community, well-being, healthy mind and body, but also livelihood and economy as well. But more than that, they build trust, values, and perception in order to create a co-creative livelihood and economy at the end of the day. My concluding thoughts for today for risk, resilience, and governance is to say that the paradigm shift in the mindset is very fundamental first step for disaster risk management in Thailand. So we need to build a society that really moves from institutional reliance to individuals and community self-governance. This will shift focus from government-led approach to people-centric approach and proactive solutions on the ground.
So now let me move on to our last keynote speaker, Professor Miho Mazereeuw, Director of Urban Risk Lab, URL from MIT. Professor will share with us how to build a resilient society with collective intelligence. So please, Professor.
It was already discussed a little bit in terms of the different hazards within Thailand, seismic, landslide, flood hazard, and drought. Just to think about the PM 2.5, that's another piece that will be on part of our project consideration. And then because it's so topical and something that has been brought up already a number of times, it is important to discuss current COVID-19 situation. But I have to say that in Thailand, there has been a lot of great success that this COVID diagram here really shows what Pim was already talking about in terms of communities coming together and everybody working together to pull down this curve. This was a piece of a project by Vipappi in Disaster for Design and her team at InfoAid. And they were sharing and delivering PPEs to hospitals, this project. But what I'd like to talk about with this is really the idea of coping capacity, and that this coping capacity really exists in Thailand. And the key is to not compromise that. So this image on the right-hand side is taken from Ben Wisner's book, At Risk, which talks a great deal about hazards and vulnerabilities, but also talks about the necessity of developing more coping capacity within, within neighborhoods. So it's really about caring for society collectively. So if we go back to COVID, wearing a mask isn't necessarily only for you, but it's really to protect others and those who are most vulnerable. So we need to understand these latent inequalities within society. And so it's about this collective strength, right? And as I mentioned, Thailand showed with their COVID response that this collective coping capacity really exists, and also Pim's case studies that she just showed. And the key point is to not lose that. The other is to really understand traditional and vernacular approaches. Remember that this existing knowledge is there, and to value landscape strategies. Other strategies, which you might find humorous now, plant and animal behavior used to be really strong indicators for heavy rains and floods. And I'm sure you're thinking, well, I'm not going to listen to a buffalo when I can actually have alerts come to my phone. But my point is that we can't rely only on technology. A country that's quite close to you, and in Stefan's assessment would rank very, very high in the maturity catalog, but the 2011 Tohoku earthquake, there were a lot of lives saved through preparedness, but many of those who died, there was an over-reliance on government, on predictions of wave height, and technology and hard infrastructure of seawalls. So people who didn't see the ocean pull back or who ignored the earthquake shakes and didn't evacuate quickly, relying on technology, many of them passed away. So we don't want to rely just on that. A lot of people worry that we've lost our ability to read topography, understand watersheds, and understand ecological systems. We don't want to compromise on this. We need both very clearly. So in the lab, when we talk about resilience, we talk about community resilience. And we borrow this quote from Susan Cutler, the University of South Carolina. She says, community resilience is the ability to plan, prepare and plan for, absorb, recover from, and more successfully adapt to actual or potential adverse effects. And so how do we do that? We really try to listen first. And this is another quote that we use often. It's from Eric Ofterheide. It's more effective to learn what people tend to do naturally in a disaster and to plan around that rather than to design your plan and expect people to conform to it. So to talk a little bit about the structure of the Urban Risk Lab and highlighting a few projects along the way, we are largely architecture, urban design, and landscape architecture, but we do a lot of workshops and education. We have emergency management in the team, as well as computer science and human computer interaction, but then ethnography. And ethnography is a really important piece so that we cover and acknowledge all of the things that I've been talking about until now. So similar to PIM, we've also done a number of these kinds of workshops where we map evacuation routes, we map the immediate risks, the flood risks, but for a long time, they were all on paper. So when you're really engaging the community, how do you do this in a quicker way? How do you transform this into a digital image without taking it home and taking 2 weeks to come back to them, so that this discussion can be on the fly. So since then, we've really started developing a number of tools. So these are all created in the lab. We want to create tools to add new data easily, so we can do this risk mapping digitally. And then how do we create tools to then analyze the data easily? And so how can we do this also in a community meeting where everything is done on the fly and we can have really nuanced discussions about specific places? And then how do we start to analyze invisible data? So this is looking at sea level rise and groundwater rise in comparison to topography within a city. And then how do we create tools to understand the relationships? So all the community risk mapping that's happening is amazing and fundamental, but how do we interconnect them with other risk mapping done in other villages and other communities into the whole watershed system? And how do we then combine those data sets with other data sets that are available? So this is built form and the age of it and storm surge risk. So these are all tools that we've been building within the lab for these purposes of doing these workshops. And what we're constantly trying to figure out is how do we create an active repository for constantly updated data that can be used for creating localized plans. So we've talked a little bit about creating tools and technology that can supplement but not replace local knowledge. And then the next part of the presentation, I'd really like to talk also about connecting residents' efforts to prepare and respond with government efforts to prepare and respond. So as much as we want to turn to and learn from residents, government or top-down institutions have a scalability, they have a coherence across projects. There's ways to insert policy decisions into this, and then there's funding structures. And so it's really important to have both the residents and the top down and the bottom up. And then the other piece that we really work on in the lab is connecting people's everyday needs to resiliency needs through design, so that it's not an additional thing that you have to do in a moment of crisis, but you already know how to do it because you're using it already. So one project, we have many, but one project is this risk map project. This photograph is actually from Bangkok, taken in 2017 by Nation Photo. And it really starts to talk about this social media and cell phone capturing and sharing of information that Pim already touched upon. And so we've been working on this in a few different countries. And because we're not a software company, we're researchers, we really learn from the context and try to adapt and create things specifically for each place. The way that the system works is that we look at what the most popular ways of communicating are and how do people regularly communicate anyway. And so in Thailand, it may be the Line app, which is very popular. We're also doing this in Japan where we're using the Line app, Twitter, and Facebook. Now, since people are already, as you saw in that photograph, taking photos and sharing these very detailed flood contexts, what we're asking them is to then share that information with us as well, and then adding other geospatial layers. And then there's one side of this that comes to a public map so that everybody can inform each other. And then there's another side of this that comes to the disaster management interface. So this is very quickly just the way that the system works. It's very similar to other things that you may have seen where you're asked for a location, you're asked for the water height, you're asked for a photograph, some text, and swipe, and you submit. So this is really meant to be not just last mile communication where you're informing people of issues, but pushing information to residents, but it's also first mile communication where you're collecting information from residents and then you bringing that up to a top-down system. And the idea really here is to increase awareness and hope that people, by recognizing and sharing this information, become stewards of their own city. So what happens is as soon as that is submitted, it goes instantly to a real-time map where all the blue dots are the information that people have submitted. And the yellow is once the government has verified the information in the area. And the yellow changes to different degrees of water height according to the government standards. And so many of our projects, we see that when people wake up in the morning and they're looking to navigate through the city, as you can see, this image here says over 1,000 users per minute that they use this platform so that they can navigate safely through the city. And we're excited that we get very, very specific information that we would not be able to get from a satellite image or any kind of large top-down system. For example, the top image says, open manhole, proceed with caution, where people are warning each other of these very specific things that only people on the ground would know. We've been extending this project to also look into post-disaster assessment cards. And so before the government can come to a location to assess the damage, people can already be uploading and sharing this information directly, especially things that are dangerous. In Japan, we've continued beyond flooding into road closures, debris and landslides and many other things as well. And the road closure one also connects it to the everyday, right? So that this everyday instances of traffic issues can also be reported through this. And so again, as much as possible, connecting everyday uses to resiliency uses. And then, as I mentioned, it is not just a platform for people to reach out and share to each other, but it really intended to be a connection, a conduit between the top down and bottom up, and not a one-way thing, but a two-way. So we've been developing these dashboards for the emergency operations centers. This is one that we did for Kumamoto, Japan. And it is starting to also look into how many people are in which shelter and how crowded each of these shelters are. As you can imagine, this is especially important during these COVID times when we need to reduce the number of people in shelters, which means we're going to have more sheltering options, which means we'll need more coordination. And so having this be online and easily accessible is something that is especially important this year. And then because we have both images and text coming in, we're starting to do this automatic tagging of images so that there isn't this information overload for emergency managers. And then that they're alerted when there are peaks within the flood events. So this is a project that we call Reducing Risk Together with Collective Intelligence. And I'd like to just end with sharing a few more slides. I have a few more minutes. So this is just to re-emphasize that although we build all these tools and they're all technology based, we do other projects too that are designed and built, but the ones that I'm sharing today are technology based, but we want to make sure that it is used as a tool and a way to share and coordinate plans and to enhance awareness. But it has to build upon existing knowledge and local methods. And as John was talking too about this new normal, in the lab, we always talk about being part of this timeline, that somewhere in the country, you're in different parts of this timeline. And so it's always important to believe that it is a cycle and to always be prepared to make sure that the preparedness, both in terms of government to citizen connection, but also citizen to citizen connection is live and something that everyone is always working on. So the other piece is that resilience needs to be considered holistically. I think this is repeating a number of sentiments from the other people who've spoken to. And so while designing the built environment and respecting natural systems, we have to make sure to care for society collectively, especially the vulnerable populations.
And it's very fascinating to show us how collective information can measure and can pave the way for resilient society. And so far, what's the loophole or what's the obstacle for people to share information or to contribute to collective information?
So I think part of it is technology. That's part of the solution. I think that in terms of, so I talked about it in terms of data sets as one situation, and then in terms of personal experiences as the other. And I think in terms of data sets, it is difficult to coordinate. And then there is quite a bit of territoriality and there's quite a bit of siloing. And so different professions, different organizations, different government organizations sometimes are reluctant to share to create this larger database. But I think that is something that we can get over. And we can also start with having these smaller scale risk assessment projects come together in a collective database. And that's one way to start.
And who should be the main organization to have this collective intelligence? Should it be government or independent organization?
I think a collaboration would be ideal. I think that the nature of combining top-down and bottom-up is really important, so that there is a structure to work within. And we want the government to respond and react also, and so that the collaboration between the two is really necessary.
Ms. Pitchapa, would you like to extend or to compare with to Thailand in terms of collective intelligence, because you have been collecting lots of information on many provinces in Thailand as well, and try to encourage local community or people-centric approach to have resilient society?
I think that from our perspective, it's really about how to bring all this knowledge that all the speakers has been talking about, both at the global and international perspective, and through the tools, the new technology, and really bridges that with the context of Thailand, right? And I think as Miho already mentioned, I think in Bangkok, it's one thing, right? But also in other provinces, the way that people access technology, the way that institutions and ecosystem enables people to access technology, but also access other resources are very different and diverse. So I think that just to extend or expand beyond that, I think that the first fundamental baseline to really look at risk collectively is also to understand how each and the contextual society start thinking about risk. First of all, how do we shift their mindset towards a risk-informed or risk as everyday part of the life, right? I also think that maybe just to connect back a little bit to what John has said earlier, and which very interested me, was how do you look at, it's more like how do you decentralize the system in a way that it could maybe recollect it at some point and really rejoins as a bigger picture. So this urban cells, right? How do you prioritize and where do you prioritize to empower the resources and or also the way that risk is being managed and to what people? In order to do that, I think we need to assess, first of all, the capacities at the level of the community and of course the enabling environment around it. So that would be my responses for how do we move on really from towards a more collective society.
Professor John, the empowerment of individual and subunit community seems really important. And what do you like to reckon for each individual or each unit to try to empower themselves and to shift mindset and to build up resilient society?
I think that question relates to something that Professor Mazereeuw also mentioned, and that is that, you really want to build on what people do normally. You don't want to impose top-down rules or structures that people will have to adopt and then adhere to, because we all know, I do this personally, that, confronted with a set of rules, one of the first things that you do is you try to game those rules. And what I mean by game is you try to, adjust your behavior or adjust or bend the rules to, in a sincere way to sort of serve your own best purposes. So I want to answer on two different levels. On the individual level, I think that what people normally do is they are citizens of a city, but really maybe even more strongly, they're citizens of a neighborhood. Anybody who's lived in a large city, and I've lived in several, knows that many large cities really are collectives of neighborhoods. And so, living in New York City, I knew better the people on my block, within a 2-3 block area, I'd say hello to them in the morning, than I did when I lived in a situation where, you're living in a single family home and you're detached from others. I think that so building on that, so there's the technology and the infrastructure, the physical systems of resilience in neighborhoods, the things that I mentioned before. But then there are the social networks, the information systems, and the kind of collective will to act as a community, which I think we should think about at the neighborhood level. And that begins with the individual, because an individual subscribes to that collective very strongly. The other thing about that is I think the individual understands better the actual physical assets of their particular neighborhood, and also along with that, the risks that exist in their location than anyone else. So they know very well, they see it on a daily basis. Does this particular street regularly flood? Is there a risk of landslide in this particular, and people who live, individuals who live in those areas. So both at the scale of in real time communication of those risks, as Miho described, but also in the long term, having engaging in and participating in the planning for resilience of that location, of that place, relatively tightly bounded as a neighborhood or a district, I think is the way the individual can participate.
So Professor Miho, is that like brand new meaning of neighborhood, especially in the city? Perhaps people do not care much of one another. So to have collective intelligence to build resilient society, it means that community has to be working closely together, and that's new culture as well.
Social connections are very, very important for resilience. I think the community and how you define community sometimes gets tricky, as we see that some people get excluded from different notions of community. But I think that there are many different social networks and social systems. And so whether you fit with your neighborhood, whether you feel most connected to an organization that you're part of, there are many different communities that we all interact with and are part of. And I think figuring out where those strengths are and enhancing those strengths are then the most important things.
Stefano, in your research, you mentioned gender equality as well. And how do you see women as the change agent in terms of building resilient society?
It's a tricky question in that we didn't look into that too specifically, but what I can comment on is there is definitely a theme that emerges here around social cohesion, right? Which we measure in many ways. It's around, gender equality is one manifestation. We looked at economic indicators such as income equality. And I think there is softer elements that, a study like the one we conducted could not measure, and very much go in the direction of what Miho and Pim were talking about, right? Which is the softer bounds of community and what keeps them together. So I think, just picking up on a broad theme that everyone highlighted is that it's very hard to think about resilience in the context of the built environment and just focus on these broad categories. And sometimes as researchers, we need to do it because we need to focus on defining a problem, but there's a lot of things that cut across and that add a lot of richness that can be explored. And yeah, I love learning about these, these research efforts, and this whole community piece is something that to me is sometimes it's harder to measure, but I think it's absolutely fundamental and adds a lot to a discourse like this one.
Thank you very much for all your thoughts on how the world society, especially in cities, try to have collective information, collective intelligence, and try to build up resilient society to keep the whole society informed on risk. That seems to be the first step, and the next step is to have information and very much aware of it. you can use QR code and send feedback. And don't forget to follow IPPD page and click like so you won't miss any webinar discussion for the future.
Overall, we can see how the role of local communities is really important in building up resilience in any society, but it has to be work in tandem with other stakeholders in society as well. But overall, it's up to personal decision to contribute in building up resilient society. And that brings us to the end of this very special seminar on Thailand 2020 and beyond, building up resilient society. That's all from Thai PBS World tonight. Thank you very much for watching.